All right, everyone, it's time to refute one of the biggest modern political memes, which is the idea that libertarianism and socialism have overlap or can coexist. Let me make one preface here, one thing very clear, though, first. The European conception of the term libertarianism does not coincide with American libertarianism. This is, by the way, the one thing that they point out that's true. In that sense, when they're claiming to be libertarian socialists, most often they're claiming to be this sort of weird and sometimes it appears malleable complex of sub-political ideologies from Europe, not the LP sort of thing. When we say libertarianism in the American sense, when I talk about the ideology that I espouse, it is a form of limited government classical liberalism, a la the Enlightenment. It doesn't have anything in common with these European groups that are using the same title. In that sense, I'm also not talking about the Libertarian Party, which is a more modern conception that stands for market capitalism. On the social side, tends towards the permissive, but does still have authoritarian elements in it. But socialism and libertarianism in the sense of limiting government, constitutionalism, and restraint of power centers, of centralized power sources, whether it's the state or some other group, by the way, generally speaking, they can overlap. You can be a socialist who's very socially permissive. That is, you can be a socialist who thinks, well, on all of these ideological issues, I think that people should be uncensored, I think that people should be free to do what they want. The problem comes down then to economics. If a state or another power structure, and some of these people advocate eliminating the state but somehow maintaining socialism or communism. Can't be done, by the way, it's a utopian, absurd idea. Just like you can't have anarcho-capitalism. You can't have a structure of capitalism without some way to actually ingrain that process. That requires a state, a heavily restrained, very small night watchman or similar state can operate in that capacity. But you need to maintain a judicial system and the ability to fend off outside sources of tyranny, namely a military, which cannot be maintained in the absence of an actual central authority. The name of the game of perfecting government, and we use that term loosely because it can never become perfect because situations change, governments therefore have to have some malleability. This is a vulnerability even of more libertarian states. The problem comes down to this. The problem comes down to properly restraining them. That is, finding that little balance point at which you've got just enough of a state to maintain things and no more. And you can keep it that way more or less. A republic if you can keep it, so to speak. Anyway. With libertarian socialism, the reason it can't exist is fiscal. The reason is that if you establish a state or a non-state entity, a privatized system, an oligarchic council, a democratic system, they will all devolve towards tyranny on that fiscal basis. If the state or other group can allocate resources, and will need to allocate resources, by the way, human greed exists, therefore it will corrupt that structure. This is just the way of mankind. Greed, by the way, is an outgrowth of a natural biological process of self-preservation anyway. Most of the vices, sins, or criminal acts, the things that we consider criminal, the things that we consider sinful or evil or bad and despicable, are all outgrowths of natural human biology. This is, by the way, why I endorse capitalism. Capitalism is a natural outgrowth of human biology. The drive to do things and to achieve reward from that is an ingrained human process. It's literally the basis of survival itself. It's been ingrained in our lineage since the dawn of time. It's never going away. You're never going to have your world communism, stateless bullshit. It's not going to exist. It's adverse to human nature on too sheer a level. Anyway, socialism could be 100% socially permissive. But as long as resources are able to be intervened in, centralized, redistributed, and so forth, there will become times, stress specifically, when you have inequality. This has a counterpart. When you're talking about building the barricades and the Spanish anarchists and stuff, what ends up happening? As soon as they're under stress, the communists and anarchists begin to fight and rip each other apart like wolves for ideological purposes. As long as things are going well and you can grow your grain and stuff, it's pretty easy for people to live in peace. You could have, temporarily, by the way, a communist society. You could have a society in which people were producing enough of a surplus so they could all live comfortably and they'd all be like ants and ultimately they would be ideological mind slaves, but they could coexist in that situation. We see this in certain groups in a technical sense, although they're glued together by more than just a civic structure, like with the Amish. The Amish are semi-communal. They are technically capitalistic in an outward sense, I understand that, but in-group, they are more communal. Not communistic, but communal. They manage to make ends meet. Largely, this is due to great farming practices and a very low expectation of the technological quality of living. They don't need computers, they don't need washing machines and stuff, and they choose to live a rustic existence. Anyone who disagrees is basically cast out. and I believe in certain Amish communities, when their kid turns 18, they tell them to go out into the world for a few years and then decide whether they want to keep being Amish. I think that's really wise, by the way. It lets them cut loose at that critical moment when they should be off in college just sipping a martini or something. Studying something other than how to grow carrots. It increases their survivability as a group. But that being said, if you were to put them in a famine situation so that there wasn't enough food, I guarantee you that no matter how much faith they have and no matter how super glued their communal activities were, there'd be graft. There would be greed. People would hoard a little bit of food on the top. They'd still pitch in. They'd do whatever they could, but not to their own destruction. And this is where a libertarian and socialistic society diverge completely. The socialistic society will not be able to cope with that situation. A libertarian society can. The libertarian society says those that are able to help, generally they will anyway, especially in a time of stress. Nobody wants a bunch of orphans and waifs wandering around while they're inside of their mansion. Most people have human emotions. The socialist also errs when they presume that especially people that were born normal or even poor but became wealthy see human suffering, that they have no response because they don't have emotions. It's a form of dehumanization tactic. It really is left-wing propaganda at its core. The socialist society will be unable to maintain that framework because in a time of stress like that, one of two things will happen. Order will increase because people demand it to increase, and then you've eliminated the fundamental statelessness underpinning there, at least temporarily, and that power structure will attempt to maintain itself thereafter. We see this with bureaucracy all the time. We see this with governments. Or order will fall apart. People say the reason, provocateurs aside, people say, well, maybe the reason that this problem is happening and persisting and the reason why I'm starving is because I have to keep pitching in when I don't have anything myself. So I'm going to keep a couple of these cabbages for myself. No, I only grew 5 cabbages. Oh, I actually grew 15. Haha, we're going to be eating well for a week. That's what'll happen. Human nature kicks in. So you can be you can have a pro-liberty socialist society on its face socially and be very gregarious and permissive. Ironically enough, that would tend to weaken it. A society with a highly centralized fiscal system in which you've got micromanagement of resources to make sure everyone is equal or getting a fair share in some metric, inevitably is going to cause a situation where you have to suppress dissent, because otherwise people will come along and they'll, again, human greed will take hold. Even in a time that's not stressful, people will come to them and say, well, maybe you deserve a little bit more of your own labor. Maybe you deserve a few more of your own cabbages. Why is it that your neighbor's crops failed and so you should have to suffer for it? Your neighbor's an idiot. Look, he did something wrong. Human mercy at that point, it grapples. Human pity for other people grapples with common sense, ironically, and self-preservation. In time of stress, the latter almost invariably wins. Inevitably, that society that you've created, if you attempted to create a socialist paradise, it would collapse. This is why leftism fails. Leftism creates power structures that eventually become untenable. Like seeks like. A group that is empowered will seek more power. Only through a strong civic constraint, legal and civic, that is, the latter is based on education and human principles among the population. If you can create a bifold constraint on a highly constitutional, very limited government, you can create a long-term stable society. Look at the United States. The United States has lasted quite some time. By and large, although freedom is definitely being eroded, especially in the last few decades, by and large it's still a freer society. Going all the way back to the 1700s, there aren't many nations in the world that have lasted that long in the essence of maintaining a roughly stable republic. It managed to last through a civil war, it managed to last through the Great War and so forth. And by and large, until the last 100 years, was a mostly free society. Thereafter became a bit less free. We're talking the Civil War era first, then World War I, and you'll notice eras in which freedom are eroded a little bit. It's boiling the frog. A little bit of erosion here, 10 years later a little bit more. Don't they always coincide with major disasters, pandemics, and war? Even a society like the United States, early on, the United States fundamentally was a quasi-libertarian society, up until the Gilded Era, the first 100 years of its existence almost. In time of stress, that erodes, especially war, because that requires a more centralized response. People always say, well, the reason we lost so much men is we didn't have a rigorous enough military. They need more money, more allocation of resources. They need more equipment. They need more use of force. We need to crack down on dissenters because they were preventing people from signing up. We need to make it compulsory. We need to start a war because those people over there said bad things about us. Even a highly constrained society is not perfect. I would argue that the perfect society, or the society that would be best, would be, imagine the United States with a constitution on steroids, and it's a stronger civic underpinning, that is, a broader consensus of the general need, and you'd have to ingrain it at every level of society, the need to maintain the constraints of government. That is, that any outgrowth would have to be temporary, constrained, and legally so. It would have to be made to be temporary in an involuntary sense. You would need to balance it with private power more. You'd need to have an even more well-armed populace, a populace in which dissent was encouraged, including dissent against the libertarian system itself, but in which that was mocked roundly, largely. It would need to be a society that was very much anti-war, opposed to starting or even entering conflicts, and a society in which one of the highest national priorities is not to be afraid of things. You'd need to have almost a vaguely hedonistic sort of outlook. You'd have to have sort of the wine and cigarette approach maybe of the French at that point in order to maintain that level of civic society. And preferably, you would need to make smart decisions as often as possible to avoid some of the problems that would lead to the degradation of that libertarian society. The socialist society, meanwhile, is weaker in all of these situations. Even in times that are good, the underpinning of a highly centralized society is simply going to be worse, because that centrality will be eroding liberty and corrupting itself and attempting to improperly allocate resources inevitably, even in times that are good. In times that are good in a very, very, very libertarian, very limited society, that erosion is minimal if existent at all. That's about all. Peace out.